Hello, my name is Tyler Malloy, and the title of my presentation is Resource Rational Cognitive Modeling, an Information Theoretic Approach. So here's a brief roadmap of what I'll be discussing today. Firstly, I'll go through an introduction of the research question as well as some background. Then I'll go through the background for the cognitive model that I'm going to present today before describing in detail the first experiment on visual-based, utility-based decision-making and change detection, and then the next experiment on visual-based learning and change detection. Then I will describe in full detail the cognitive model that I'm going to propose in this thesis, then some analysis of the cognitive model I will propose, as well as comparisons with alternative models, then a brief discussion of conclusions, including future areas of research. Before getting into the research importance, I want to raise a broad question, which is the following. How do cognitive constraints impact behavior? And I'm going to use some specific examples as well as the experiments today to narrow down this question and help better understand it. And with that, I can get into a description of this research importance as well as its real-world implications. Much of our daily lives involves decision-making in environments based on visual information. However, typically there's too much visual information for us to process everything that we have available to us at one time. To account for this, we direct attention onto areas of the visual scene that contain information relevant for the current task at hand, such as the crosswalk sign and other information. This raises the question of how humans form representations of visual information when they are completing a task. There are many possible approaches to achieving this goal, one being to minimize the complexity of representations, such as the following, where we are just representing this information as a 0 if we should wait and a 1 if we should cross the street. This has the benefit of making decision-making based on the representations that we form easy because in a sense the decision has already been made for us. However, it is a less accurate representation of the real world, and it is more cognitively demanding to go from what we are visually attending to that representation formation. Another alternative would be to try to represent as veridically as possible all of the visual information that we attend to. So everything that we see, we try to form a representation that accurately reflects that. This has the benefit of accurately portraying the real world. However, it makes decision-making based on our representations more difficult, and it's more demanding on our memory. Between these two extremes, there is the idea of balancing the reconstruction accuracy and the current task at hand, which looks something like this, where we're forming a representation that spends more informational resources on areas of the visual scene that are relevant for the task at hand, while also keeping in our representation other parts of the scene that may be less relevant. This has the benefit of reflecting real cognitive demands of humans, both in terms of memory and representation formation. Additionally, I'm interested in the idea of learning based on visual information and specifically how this impacts how we form representations. Here we have an example of a somewhat novel environment of a British crosswalk where we have similar but slightly different visual information that we need to attend to. And this raises the question of how humans update their representation formation strategies when they are learning. And with that, we can form a more narrowed down version of that research question I introduced previously. And specifically, I want to answer how humans represent visual information when making decisions and how learning impacts this. Alongside this research question, I'm going to propose the following hypotheses. So firstly, I'm going to suggest that human visual representations are both information constrained and task dependent. Additionally, that human learning and decision-making is influenced by visual representation formation. And finally, that these two effects are interrelated and cannot be fully understood by studying either in isolation. And with that, I can get into some background for the cognitive model that I'm going to propose today. So firstly, to give some background on the motivation behind the model, David Marr proposed the 3 levels of analysis that can be used to understand the functioning of information processing systems. The highest level is the computational, which expresses the nature or the goal of computation, such as in this example on the right, the goal of maximizing utility in a decision-making problem. The next level down is the algorithmic level, which describes a specific commitment to mechanisms, such as utilizing the maximum expected utility theory equation in order to determine which option has the highest expected utility. The next level is the implementation level, which describes a specific realization of the algorithms described at the previous level into a hardware. And this could be, for instance, the neurons of the human brain or computer hardware that's instantiating a cognitive model predicting human behavior. These levels of analysis are helpful in that they allow us to compare functioning of cognition and cognitive agents across different levels of analysis. One approach to achieving this is resource rational analysis, which seeks to understand cognition across these levels of analysis by grounding them in a common language, specifically by understanding cognition as a type of optimization under constraints. And there are many possible solutions to the goal of optimization under constraints, and the specific one that I'm going to use in this talk is information theoretic analysis. Information theory has a long history of applications, most notably by Claude Shannon through his introduction of the concept of Shannon information, which was applied onto the information processing of systems such as telegraphs and telephones. Soon after Claude Shannon developed his concept of information theory, it was utilized by psychologists such as George Miller and applied onto perceptive intelligibility in humans, firstly in speech intelligibility, and then next, perhaps most famously, in the remembering of numbers in his work, The Magic Number 7. The model I'll discuss today seeks to achieve the goals of resource rational analysis by solving for that problem of optimization under constraints through the use of information theory, which is largely broad in its application. The model I'm going to discuss today is an example of a class of cognitive models based on artificial neural networks, which have a long history of connections with biological cognition. One of the first biologically inspired neural networks is the neocognitron, developed by Fukushima and Miyake in 1982, which developed the concept of a convolution, whereby subsequent layers of an artificial neural network had nodes that were calculated by weighted values of a 2-dimensional region in the previous layer of the network. And this was inspired by neurophysiological findings in biological visual perception, most notably the hierarchy structure of visual processing developed by Hubel and Wiesel in 1963. A more recent approach to modeling perception seeks to do so through the use of so-called encoders, which form low-dimension and informationally constrained representations of stimuli, which can be visual stimuli or others, and learns these encodings such that they can be reconstructed as accurately as possible given the information bottleneck imposed by the dimensionality of this encoding. These are beneficial in that it allows us to form informationally constrained representations of highly complex information. However, the information constraint is only based on the size of this encoding. The model used in this work is based on a beta variational autoencoder, which learns encodings with a variable information bottleneck. By training latent units to maximize reconstruction accuracy under an information theoretic constraint on the complexity of these latent units. This is our connection between the goals of resource rationality and information theoretic analysis. These latent units learned by beta variational autoencoders have been shown to align very closely to individual neuron activity in the primate face area of macaque monkeys while they were observing images of human faces. A closely related model to the one that I'm going to present today was developed by Bates and Jacobs in order to predict human categorization of visual information. The model is essentially a beta variational autoencoder, which forms a memory module. And based on these memories, there's a separate decision module that makes predictions of categorization of visual information. The model I present today in this thesis extends this general idea onto utility-based decision-making and reinforcement learning. As I mentioned earlier, we're not only interested in visual decision-making, but also learning and how learning impacts representation formation. There are many types of human learning, one being reinforcement-style learning, which can be described through the following model. There is a policy function, which defines an agent's behavior as a function that maps from the state or stimuli presented to an agent onto an action that they can perform in the task or environment. They perform that task, and based on the dynamics of the environment, they observe a reward as well as a change in state that lets the agent know how well they are performing. Reinforcement learning is related most closely to human learning through the dopamine reward prediction error hypothesis, which suggests that activity of phasic dopamine in the mammalian midbrain encodes a signal that is analogous to the temporal error update, which is used in reinforcement learning models to update the behavior of agents based on the action they perform and the state and reward they observe. And with that, I can move on to a description of the first experiment involving visual-based decision-making as well as change detection. So in this experiment paradigm, there are two types of tasks which are randomized throughout the experiment. There are both utility judgment trials and change detection trials. However, on all trials, it begins with the same type of stimulus consisting of 2 jars of 9 differently colored marbles, as well as the values of the marbles on the top of the screen. And I'll go through an example of this in the next couple slides. So in all trials, participants see the same type of stimulus. There is a brief mask period after which the participant is shown which of the 2 possible tasks they will be performing. Here they're performing the change detection task, meaning that they need to indicate by pressing a key on the keyboard whether or not they believe that this jar of marbles is the same or different from the one that they were shown previously in the same location. In this example, the participant incorrectly indicated that these jars were different when they were actually the same, and as a result, they got 0 points, and the ultimate goal of the participant is to get the highest number of points possible. After receiving the reward signal, they are shown a new stimulus consisting of, again, randomized jars of marbles. And then there's a brief mask period again where they need to hold in memory both the utility information and the visual information of these jars of marbles. And then they are shown which of the 2 tasks. Here it is the jar selection task, where they need to select one of the 2 jars to receive a marble randomly drawn from. So ideally, they will select the jar that has the highest average utility, or whichever one they prefer. After making this selection, the participant receives the purple marble and the points associated with it that they were shown previously. The design of this experiment was constructed to allow us to investigate possible biases in how humans form representations of visual information, specifically based on the utility associated with that visual information. In this task, participants must store information in memory, both related to utility and visual information, and use it in these 2 different ways, both in reconstruction and these utility judgments. Previous applications of the proposed model did investigate the utility-based decision-making and learning settings, and that was the inspiration for the inclusion of this change detection task in this experiment. In this first experiment, there was an initial practice period of 20 change detection and utility selection examples in which the participants had an unlimited amount of time to respond and view the stimulus in order to get adequate experience with the task. Then during the main experiment, there were 10 change detection and 10 utility selection trials, randomly assorted within a block of 20 total trials, and additionally there were 10 total trial blocks. Again, during the main experiment, there was 2 seconds to view the stimulus, a 1-second mask, 2 seconds to make a decision, and 2 seconds to observe the reward. In total, there were 300 participants recruited through Amazon Mechanical Turk. with 143 participants demonstrating good enough performance for data analysis. The first experiment expectation that we have is that participants will demonstrate biases in their accuracy of change detection judgments based on the difference between the utility of the initial and the change stimuli on trials where there is a change occurring. This is expected due to our hypothesis that visual reconstructions are formed to balance the accuracy of reconstruction and the utility associated with that visual stimuli, both in relation to cognitive constraints. An additional expectation is that participants will demonstrate risk-averse behavior in their utility selection tasks. This is typically seen in utility-based decision-making under uncertainty, especially with both time constraints and sufficiently complex stimuli. Here's a description of what we mean by risk-averse behavior. So on trials where the two stimuli had the exact same mean expected utility, participants selected the option with lower outcome variance about 75% of the time, meaning that there was a preference for stimuli that had more sure outcomes over ones that had a risky chance at receiving a higher value outcome. Additionally, this effect can be seen on trials when the mean utility is not exactly the same by comparing the effect of utility outcome variance on the probability of selecting a stimuli. And that's the exact effect that we're demonstrating here. On the x-axis, we're plotting the difference between the utility standard deviations of the left and right stimuli, and then on the y-axis, we're plotting the probability of selecting the left stimulus. So when the left stimulus has a much lower standard deviation of outcomes, it is a more sure outcome, and the participants are more likely to select that option. However, as the relative standard deviation decreases, the probability of selecting a specific stimuli decreases along with it. And the slope of this bar is essentially demonstrating across all participants the level of their risk-averse preference. The next expectation that I mentioned previously was there to be a bias in change detection based on utility. If participants were basing their change detection on visual information alone, then that could allow for very accurate judgments. In this case, these two stimuli have the same expected utility, but very different visual information. So it should be easy for a participant to make this judgment. However, because of our hypothesis that participants are forming representations based on not only visual information but also utility, it may be more difficult to tell that these two stimuli are different. And the way that we test this is by comparing the effect of utility difference on the probability of detecting a change. So when the utility difference between the initial and change stimuli is relatively low, we also have a relatively low probability of detecting that change. And this probability increases as the utility difference between the two stimuli increases. There is a potential confound in the relationship between the utility and visual information in the data set. However, many stimuli have very different visual information associated with them with the exact same utility. However, we can perform an additional comparison of all stimuli pairs to test whether or not this is a general effect in the data set. And that's what we are comparing here. So on the x-axis, we're comparing the visual difference between all stimuli pairs in the data set in terms of the mean squared error of their visual information. And on the y-axis, we're comparing the utility difference of them. So we can see there are many cases where visual stimuli have roughly the same visual difference, but a wide range of utility differences. And across the whole data set, there doesn't seem to be a general trend. So summarizing our results from the first experiment on our participants' behavior, they demonstrated risk-averse behavior in making utility judgments, which demonstrated how cognitively demanding this task was. Additionally, there was a bias in the accuracy of change detection based on the utility of stimuli, supporting the hypothesis that reconstructions are formed to balance utility and the accuracy of reconstruction. And with that, we can move on to the second experiment on visual utility-based learning and change detection. In our second experiment, we had the same recruitment and payment structure as the first experiment. There were 150 participants in total, with 81 demonstrating good performance. The main difference between this experiment and the previous one was that the values of marble jars were hidden, and selecting a jar received a random value drawn from the outcome distribution of that jar. So values of marble colors were additionally randomized after each trial block to one of 5 possibilities, meaning that the participants had to relearn the exact values of each of the marbles in the jar. And this is an example of what the stimuli would look like in the second experiment. It's essentially the same, except there's no values of the marbles at the top. Thinking back to what we observed from participants in the previous experiment, we can form hypotheses about what we expect of human behavior in this experiment. We should expect that on early trials of the block, when the utility of a stimuli is not known to a high degree of accuracy, it shouldn't be taking up as much of the representation space, and thus it shouldn't significantly bias this change detection accuracy of participants. However, on later trials, when the utility has been learned, it is expected that stimuli utility will bias change detection accuracy. Previously, in the decision-making setting, we noticed a bias in the probability of detecting change based on the utility difference of the two stimuli. And the slope of this regression fit to participant behavior can tell us how impactful utility is in determining whether or not a participant will detect change. As this regression slope goes to 0, utility becomes essentially irrelevant for predicting change, meaning that participants aren't forming representations to bias utility. However, as this slope increases, utility becomes more and more relevant. So keeping this ratio in mind, it is essentially describing the impact that the utility difference has on the likelihood of detecting change. And as we mentioned, we should expect the impact of utility on change detection to increase throughout learning in the second experiment. And this is the exact effect that we observe as we compare the utility detection ratio through a single trial block. On early trials, when there have been fewer utility observations, the slope of that change detection regression is essentially flat, meaning that before utility has been learned, it is not impacting change detection accuracy. However, on later trials, utility becomes more relevant for predicting whether or not a participant will recognize a change in the stimuli. And this provides support for the hypothesis that representations are formed to balance the current task as well as information constraints. So here we can summarize the main behavioral results from this experiment. Firstly, change detection was not biased by utility on early trials of the task. However, it became more relevant for predicting change on later trials. And this supports our hypothesis regarding reconstruction accuracy and task relevance relative to specific cognitive constraints. And with that, I can move on to a full description of the cognitive model I'm going to propose today, as well as a comparison of related models. So here is a full list of all the models that I'm going to use for comparison. Firstly, we have models that only make utility prediction judgments. So there are 2 shown here, and I'll describe them in more detail later. Then we have 2 models that only make change detection predictions. And finally, we have 3 models, including the 1 model that I'm going to propose today, that make predictions in both cases. So here is a schematic of the proposed model, which we call the Utility Beta Variational Autoencoder, or UBVAE. It consists of a beta variational autoencoder that forms informationally constrained representations of visual stimuli, which in this case is a jar of marbles. These representations take the form of a distribution that is sampled from, The sample is fed back through decoder layers to form a noisy reconstruction of the original stimulus, as well as being fed into a separate utility prediction module that makes predictions of the utility associated with these stimulus. This entire network, utility predictions for the utility selection task are based on the output of this utility prediction module, and predictions of change detection are made based on the similarity of these latent representation samples between the initial and change stimuli. This entire model is trained with the following training objective, which is a little complex, but can be better understood by breaking it into its constituent parts. So at the top, we have the stimuli reconstruction accuracy, meaning that reconstructions are trained to be as accurate as possible. Then we have a weighted value of the latent representation complexity, which allows for that adjustable information bottleneck. And then we additionally have a weighted value of the accuracy of our utility predictions, meaning that we're training for those utility predictions to be as close to the mean expected utility as possible. To compare the proposed model against related approaches, we have a deep convolutional neural network. Here, the model is learning to categorize the marble color of the input stimuli as well as make utility predictions. This model makes predictions in the same way, where utility prediction output is used in the utility judgment task, and this final fully connected layer of the artificial neural network is used for change detection judgments. This is a useful comparison because it allows us to compare the usefulness in the representations learned by beta variational autoencoders in making both utility judgments and change detections, and comparing it to a closely related model that is trained in a different manner. So there are many models of utility prediction used in comparison. However, they all use the same general approach of using a softmax function to form a probability distribution between the left and right stimulus. However, they differ in how they make estimates of the value of the stimuli. So the first one makes estimates of the value of the stimulus in terms of the mean expected utility. This utility prediction method can be said to be naive in a sense because it is not attempting to directly model the observed bias in human behavior, specifically the risk-averse behavior of participants. The next model is called the cumulative prospect theory model, which is inspired by Kahneman and Tversky's work in cumulative prospect theory. And this is a model that is directly trying to model that bias that was observed in participants. The way that that is done is by estimating the value of a stimuli, not only in terms of the mean expected utility, but also by adding a weighted value of the standard deviation of them, which accounts for how participants have individual preferences for risk. In addition to this, the convolutional neural network makes predictions of the value just as the output of the neural network. And additionally, there is a sparse version of this CNN that has a smaller final fully connected layer, which is the input to that utility prediction module. And this is just to allow for a tighter information bottleneck to mimic the information bottleneck property of the beta variational autoencoder in the proposed model. And finally, we have our utility beta E approach, which again makes predictions of utility just as the output of that utility prediction module. Here we are comparing the predictive accuracy, which is the probability that the model assigns on to the selection that the human participant actually makes. We can see that in the CPT model, when we are directly trying to model through the use of an additional parameter, the risk-averse effect in humans, we achieve the highest predictive accuracy. However, making judgments based on utility alone is not very accurate. The next most accurate here is the utility beta E model, which is just making those predictions based on the output of that network, and the two deep neural network approaches have slightly lower performance. In addition to predicting utility selection, we're also predicting change detection, which is done in a similar manner, essentially a softmax function. But here, instead of measuring the value of a single stimulus, we are measuring the change between the initial stimuli and the changed stimulus. So the way that this is done, there is again a naive approach that is just basing predictions based on the visual difference between one stimuli and the next stimuli. And that is fed into the softmax function. And then again, we have a model that's directly trying to represent the bias that is observed in participants by not only looking at the visual difference, but also a weighted value of the utility difference, which is shown here. And then again, we have the convolutional neural network methods, two of them, that are making judgments of the change between one stimuli and another based on the difference between the mean squared error difference between the final fully connected layer of the network when it is processing the first and second stimulus. And then finally, we have the proposed model, which is the utility plus beta VAE model, which makes estimates of the change of one stimuli and another based on the difference of that latent sample. So here again, we can see that if we are directly trying to model the observed bias in human participant behavior, we can get very accurate predictive accuracy in detecting change. And in comparison, just basing it on visual information alone does not allow for very accurate predictions. The utility beta VE model that we propose does have similarly high and slightly higher even potentially predictive accuracy than the utility model, and meanwhile making judgments of whether or not human participants will detect change based on the similarity of this final fully connected layer of this convolutional neural network does not appear to allow for accurate predictions of change detection. So summarizing across the two different types of tasks, we have the three models that make predictions on all trial types. The CNN model did have close to the same utility selection accuracy as the utility beta VE. However, due to its very low performance in the change detection trial, the highest performing model was the utility beta VE model. In the learning setting, instead of training the deep neural network models to output the true mean expected utility associated with the stimuli, there is a separate reinforcement learning model that is used to update the model's predictions based on experience. The way that that is done is through what's called feature reinforcement learning, whereby a model tries to learn three values associated with the orange, purple, and green marbles in the jars. Then, based on the real behavior of the participants as they interacted with the task, they make a selection and observe a reward associated with it. And based on the difference between these color value predictions and the reward that was observed, the values are updated based on that experience, and this allows us to make predictions of the human participants as they are learning the utility associated with the different stimuli. The predictions from this feature reinforcement learning model are used as training for all the deep neural network-based models, so the convolutional neural networks and the proposed model. And here we can again compare the predictive accuracy of our baseline tabular feature reinforcement learning model and the three deep neural network models. Here, the feature reinforcement learning model sort of serves as the upper bound on the predictive accuracy in the utility selection task because it's the source of those utility predictions of the utility as the agent is learning them. However, the utility beta VE model has similarly high predictive accuracy. Then on the change detection trials, we see more or less what we observed in the previous experiment. The two deep neural network approaches are not accurately reflecting change detection in the human participants, meaning that averaging across them, the beta VAE has similarly high predictive accuracy as the FRL model, but a key aspect here being that it takes as input the actual visual stimuli presented to participants and learns representations associated with them instead of being a tabular method that's just learning this specific task. So summarizing across the modeling results for our two experiments, the beta VAE model was outperforming all models apart from the CPT and utility-based models in their respective tasks, meaning that the proposed model demonstrated similarly accurate predictions without needing to directly model the expected behavioral bias, as was the case with these two alternative approaches. Additionally, the beta VAE model has similarly high predictive accuracy across both tasks in the second experiment. These results raise the question of whether or not the information-constrained utility beta VE model also produces biases similar to what was observed in human participants, and that's what we will discuss in the next section on modeling analysis. So as I mentioned, there were three main biases present in human behavior. Firstly, risk-averse utility selection, a bias in change detection based on utility, and additionally, an update of that utility-based bias as utility was learned throughout the learning setting. And we can ask whether or not the proposed utility beta VE model is demonstrating these same biases in these three ways. And that's exactly what we're demonstrating in this graph. Here we're plotting the exact same utility standard deviation difference on the x-axis, and then plotting the probability of selecting the stimuli. But here, this is the probability of the utility beta VE model in selecting that stimuli based on this utility standard deviation, meaning that the proposed model demonstrates the same risk-averse effect as participants once the model has been trained to accurately predict the utility of the stimuli. Again, we can compare the probability of change detection based on the difference between the initial and change stimuli to show that we have the same bias. As utility is very low, there's a lower probability of detecting change, and as that utility increases, the utility difference increases, it becomes more and more likely that the model will predict a change. Similarly, we can compare how this change detection updates as the model learns utility associated with the stimuli. Before utility-based training, the model predicts no bias in change detection based on utility. However, as the model learns utility, it becomes more and more significantly biased based on utility. So again, summarizing for both participant behavior and the proposed model, utility selection is risk-averse. There is a bias in change detection accuracy based on utility difference, and this change detection bias is updated as utility is learned. So with the presence of these three biases in the proposed model, we can ask the question of where these three biases come from. So firstly, we can try to answer the question of what is causing the utility beta VE model to be risk averse. And the way that I'm going to try to explain this is use an analogy to explain how information constraints in the representation of utility can lead to risk averse behavior. And so in order to illustrate that, we can think of a method of estimating the utility associated with two jars of marbles by taking a limited sampling of those marble jars and then taking the mean of that sample. So in this case, we have a small sampling of the outcomes of these two different jars, and here we end up predicting a selection of the marble jar with a lower variance, which is demonstrating that risk-averse behavior. But we can test whether or not this is generally true of these small sample sizes by taking 1,000 means of sample size 2 and confirming that on about 55% of the time, when we're making judgments based on this method of estimating, we end up selecting the option with a lower outcome variance. However, if we were to compare this to the case where we are taking samples of size 100, then the distribution of the way that we're representing this utility looks something like this. And because it is more peaked and more centered around the true mean utility of the both stimuli, it ends up negating that risk-averse effect that was demonstrated when we had a smaller and flatter outcome distribution for our utility estimate. And what's important is that these more peaked and more centered distributions are more informationally complex. So, smaller outcome samples produce risk-averse behavior and result in less informationally complex representations of utility, compared to larger outcome samples, which negate the effect of that risk-averse behavior, but represent utility in a more informationally complex way. It's important to remember that this is not exactly analogous to the way that information is being represented in the utility beta VE model, as utility is associated with both as the representations are reflecting both visual information and utility. However, it does illustrate how information constraints on utility representation can lead to biases that look like risk-averse behavior. So in order to address the source of this change detection bias in utility formation, based on utility, here we are comparing across all stimuli pairs of the utility beta VE model. Once it has learned to predict utility, how similar are the representations of these stimuli compared to their utility difference? And we can see a very clear correlation effect where as the utility difference increases, so does the representation difference. This means that stimuli with more similar utility are being represented as more similar in representation space, which results in a bias of change detection accuracy because that change detection is being based on those representations. Additionally, we can see how this effect is updated throughout time by comparing early trials when utility is not known to a high degree of accuracy to later trials once the utility is known very well. Early on in training, before the utility of the stimuli is known, there is no clear bias based on the representation similarity of stimuli pairs and their utility difference, meaning that on early trials of the task, there shouldn't be any utility-based bias in this change detection judgment. However, as utility is learned, that stimuli representation difference does appear to be biased based on utility. Additionally, we can ask the question of how utility-based training impacts stimuli reconstruction. So here in the top row, we are showing the original stimuli. Then we have, after a short pre-training period, the reconstructions of these stimuli, just to indicate that with a limited training, the models only reconstruct the most common marble, which is purple, very accurately, and they don't accurately reconstruct the green marbles because they're less frequent. Then if we continue this training period without any utility feedback, then the model still does not learn to accurately reconstruct the orange or green marbles. However, if we do start to tell the model the utility associated with these stimuli, it learns to differentiate the marbles based on utility because that becomes relevant for predicting utility, and that aids in the reconstruction of these marble jars, both in the purple but also higher value green and orange marbles. So we can begin to take some conclusions, main takeaways, and future directions for this research. The first experiment main conclusions are that participants were risk averse and preferred smaller rewards if they were associated with more deterministic outcomes. Additionally, participants demonstrated biases in change detection based on the difference between the utility of the original and new stimuli. Additionally, the utility beta VE model demonstrated both biases while accurately predicting human participant behavior resulting from information-constrained representation formation and not relying on directly modeling the biases observed in human behavior. Additionally, for the second experiment, participants had change detection that was not biased based on utility on early trials of the block. However, once utility had been learned on later trials, it was biased. Again, the utility beta VE model demonstrated both of these biases while accurately predicting human participant behavior, again resulting from these information-constrained representations. Some of the main limitations of this work is the lack of eye tracking data, which makes the impact of attention on utility biases in representation formation less clear. It would be very interesting to look at how eyes attend to marbles differently based on their utility. Additionally, there was a lack of fMRI or other neural recording data, which made the correlation of representation formation and learning less clear. Similarly, it would be very interesting to look at whether or not these biases on representation formation are shown out through differences in fMRI or other neural activity. while performing this task. So for future directions, one of the easiest ways to address these limitations would be to collect recordings of either eye tracking data or neural activity while participants perform this task. Additionally, it can always be extended onto additional learning and decision-making domains, ones that are either more complex or more closely associated with naturalistic environments. And with that, I want to give a special thanks to my thesis committee, Chris, Brett, Brahm, and Tim, as well as the rest of the Adaptive Cognition Lab, Zemming and Rachel, the Perception and Action Lab, Nate, Scott, Grace, and AJ, the IBM RL Research Group, Jerry, Meow, and Matt, and finally the RPI IBM AI Horizons Research Collaboration, which is led by Lisa and James. Thank you, and I have time for some questions.